Hey guys, what's up? Murphy's Opinions here, and today I'm coming at you with a new video today. And today I'll be looking at the career of George Harrison, and today I'm going to ranking all of his albums. Now, before we get started, I just want to make a few things clear. Obviously, from the kind of image I'm using here, there are some albums on here that I'm not going to include in the ranking. I'm not going to include Wonderwall music or electronic sound, just because they're just sort of instrumental albums. I've not actually listened to them. I've listened to half of Wonderwall music, but I've not listened to any of electronic sound. I'm not including Live in Japan, even though I have listened to that album, and that's a very good album, but I'm only doing studio albums. So basically anything from All Things Must Pass to Brainwashed, excluding Live in Japan, is game for here. So there's 10 albums in total, and without further ado, let's just get into the ranking. I do want to say I actually don't dislike any of these albums. I do think the top 6 are a class above, I'd say, the bottom sort of 4 albums, but I still like the bottom 4 albums. I think they've got some stuff that's worth listening to. So anyway, without further ado, let's get into the list and kick things off with number 10. At number 10 we have Dark Horse, which was released in 1974. I think when it comes to this album, I definitely wouldn't say it's bad. I've seen a lot of people say that this album's, it's bad, it's terrible, it's rubbish. I wouldn't say that. I think the thing with this album is it's one of those albums where when you go into it, obviously I know of the songs, but they're not. The majority of the songs are not necessarily songs that I really remember until I really start listening to them, and a lot of them, as I said, they're just not that memorable for the most part. I think the standout tracks really here are Harry's on Tour Express, which is a really cool instrumental and a pretty nice way to open the album, and just for future reference as well for all these albums. I've got these. I'm talking about the Spotify versions, just in case I talk about a track that maybe isn't on the album or whatever. For some people, just to clear that up. But yeah, Harry's on Tour is a pretty nice instrumental to kick off the album. Ding Dong Ding Dong, I think, is a fun little song. It's always kind of confused me. Is it a Christmas song or a New Year's song? But regardless, I think it's a fairly underrated song. I think it's one of the fun George Harrison songs, kind of like I guess Piggies from the White Album in a sense. The title track Dark Horse I think is really good actually. I think that's definitely one of my favourite George Harrison songs actually. But actually I do think, and on this album anyway, they've got an early take version of Dark Horse. And I do think that's better than the original, but obviously that's not available on every album. But yeah, the title track Dark Horse I think is really good actually. I think it's I would say easily the best song on this album. So at the bottom we have Dark Horse. Let's get on to number 9. At number 9 we have Somewhere in England from 1981, the first solo Beatles album to be released after John Lennon's death. And this album isn't that well received critically. A lot of people didn't really like it. As I said, I like this album. I think it's good. I wouldn't say there's really any songs in general when it comes to George Harrison songs. There aren't really any sort of songs where I'm like, oh god, this is awful. I think it's more just the fact that there are some songs that necessarily aren't that memorable. And this kind of applies here, I guess. But for me, the standout tracks here really are obviously All Those Years Ago, the most successful song from the album about John Lennon, which is a really nice sort of tribute to John. One of my personal favourite George Harrison songs. Baltimore Oriole, I think, is really underrated as well. I really like the how that's done. I really like that song. Teardrops as well, I think, is really great. And Save the World, I think, is a really nice little song. I've seen people kind of criticise that song and say it's not really that good. I disagree. I think it's quite a fun little song with the sound effects, and I think the sort of message behind the song is quite interesting. And overall, I think Somewhere in England, it's not like an amazing album. It's not one of George's best, but I'd definitely say it's a solid attempt. And the fact that this is one of his weakest, I think, just is a testament to how good he really is, in my opinion. At number 8, we have Gone Troppo from 1982. And this is an album that, it's not critically kind of bashed, but it's an album I think a lot of people forget about. And at the time, I'm pretty sure it really didn't chart well at all. Yeah, the album didn't really do that well in terms of sales and stuff. which I think is a shame because this isn't a bad album. I definitely think it's a very solid album overall. I mean, I think the standout tracks here for me is "Wake Up My Love," "That's the Way It Goes," "Gone Troppo," "Mystical One," "Dream Away" as well. I think the only real complaint I really have about this album is on one of the songs, "I Really Love You," and a couple of times like sort of the backup vocals as well. Sometimes George does this effect on his voice and it lowers it, and that's, I'd rather him just sing it normally. But apart from that, I mean, the songs here on here are very well written, I think. Even though the kind of the voice on "I Really Love You" isn't necessarily how I would have liked to have been done, it's very well written. I can't criticise that at all. And overall, I think "Gone Troppo" is just an underrated album in general. I think it's, if you haven't necessarily heard it, I would say give it a chance. At number 7, we have "Extra Texture," and this again is another album that's really not that well. It's pretty critically at the time. It's pretty wasn't well received critically, but I really like this album. I think it's got some really good songs on here. For example, I think the opening track, "You," I think is a really nice little song. I see a lot of people kind of complain about the voice that George kind of goes for here, and it's a bit like how high pitched and kind of whiny it is. That's fair enough, but one thing I never really get is you get people kind of saying, "Oh yeah, it's, I don't like the whiny stuff," but then they always say, "Oh yeah, but the track 'You' is good," which doesn't really make sense because, well, it's the whiniest track on there. If you don't believe me, listen to the whole album, and "You" kicks off the album, and you'll see it's the whiniest track, but I don't mind it personally. I think it works on some of the songs. And "The Answers at the End" is also a really good song as well. "This Guitar Can't Keep From Crying," I'd say is the best track on here. A bit more of use, like a fun little instrumental from the song "You." I think that's pretty. I quite like it. I mean, I kind of wish it was longer, to be honest. I do really like as well "Can't Stop Thinking About You." I know a lot of people kind of complain about the repetition of the phrase, but I still think it's a really nice song, to be honest. And "Tired of Midnight Blue" as well, I think is another really great track on here. Overall, just an underrated album. I think it just gets a bit too much hate, in my opinion. A very strong album, I think, for me. Never seen such a beautiful girl. At number 6, we have 33 1/3 from 1976, and I definitely say these next 6 albums are, I'd say, kind of a class above the last 2 albums, and I'm not saying those albums are terrible, but these albums I just think are really, really strong, and some of George's best work. Standout tracks on here for me would definitely be "Woman, Don't You Cry For Me," "Beautiful Girl," which I think is probably the best song on this album, "This Song," which is a nice little song kind of about the court and legal issues with the song "My Sweet Lord." It kind of pokes fun at that, which I think is a really nice little song. You've got as well "It's What You Value," and "Crackerbox Palace" as well, which I think is again one of those kind of fun little creative songs, and it's a nicely produced song as well. I think this song, what kind of a lot of people liked about this album is it's kind of more similar to his kind of Beatle days, I guess, than some of the other albums, I guess, really since kind of "All Things Must Pass." And again, that's one of those things I do like it when George kind of does that. And I think there's another album that kind of reminds me of it. But I always kind of liked it when he kind of experimented a bit and tried different things. But it was nice to see him kind of, in my opinion, go back, sort of not to his roots, but just sort of going back to his kind of older style in a sense. Brainwashed by our leaders, by our kings and queens. At number 5, we have the last George Harrison album, Brainwashed, and this is obviously released after he died. He'd obviously recorded all the songs and stuff, but basically Jeff Lynne from the Electric Light Orchestra and Traveling Wilburys, so he's a good friend of George, and his son Danny Harrison sort of produced the album. And yeah, it's a really nice kind of goodbye to George. The only real thing I can complain about the album as a whole is I maybe would have liked to have had a nice picture of George on the cover. But anyway, on to the actual songs, I think "Any Road" is probably the best song on here, and it kicks off the album. I think that's just one of my favourite George Harrison songs in general. "Looking for My Life" is a nice little song as well. Rising Sun, I think, is a really nice tune as well. Between the Devil and the Deep Blue Sea, I think is a really, again, another one of those underrated George Harrison songs. It's not actually written by him, but it's a really nice ukulele cover, and it's just a nice little song. And Brainwashed, the title song's good as well. You've got other songs like Stuck Inside a Cloud, Marwar Blues, which is pretty good as well. Just a really solid album overall, and definitely a really good album to close off George's career. At number 4, we have George Harrison's self-titled album, George Harrison. And yeah, this is a really fantastic album. I'd say these next sort of 4 albums would definitely, I would consider some of my all-time favourite albums, really. These are just fantastic albums. And the real kind of standout tracks here for me are Love Comes to Everyone, I think, is a song with a really simple message, but I think it's just a really well-written song overall. Not Guilty as well is a fun little song. Originally kind of written, and there's a recording of it actually in the Beatles years. I believe it was kind of like 68, 69, but it was never actually released. I prefer the kind of I prefer the take on this album to the kind of take with the Beatles. I think it's better as in a more kind of sort of chilled kind of, I guess chilled. It's a lot more laid back than the Beatles kind of version of it was more rocky. But I think it works better as a more slower tempo kind of song. Here Comes the Moon's a nice little song that kind of has kind of Here Comes the Sun kind of, obviously its title similar, and it gives all the similar kind of vibes, but in its own way it creates its own kind of original thing, and I think that's probably the best, one of the best songs on the album, apart from one song. Blow Away, I'd say, is probably my favourite. Really sort of catchy chorus, especially. I think Faster is another really good song. I think that's it's a song about Formula One, and obviously George Harrison was a really big Formula One fanatic, so it's a really cool kind of song about Formula One. And overall, it's just a really fantastic album. Especially, I'd say the kind of first half of the album, especially, is really good. Got caught up in the material world. I found it especially hard to kind of choose between whether to put the previous album at number 3 or this one, but I decided to go with Living in the Material World at number 3. Overall, just a really, really strong album, some really strong songs on here, and I think lyrically, this is one of George's best albums, in my opinion. I think there's some really good songwriting on here. I've seen a few people kind of complain about how a lot of the songs are quite, kind of, they've got religious themes and they're quite spiritual. But I don't really see why that's a problem. Like, I think the main sort of problem people have with it, that it was too kind of religious, had religious. I don't really care about that. I mean, I'm not that religious myself, but I still find it interesting to listen to songs and hear other people's kind of perspectives on those sort of things. And this is a really interesting album for that. It's always weird because obviously George Harrison was a Hindu, but he writes a lot of songs about kind of God and Jesus, and it's just a really interesting kind of take on it. Give Me Love, Give Me Peace on Earth, the best song on the album for me, and one of my favourite George Harrison songs. Just a fantastic song with a really great message. Sue Me, Sue You Blues, again, is another really great song. The Light That Has Lied to the World is one of his most underrated tracks. I really do love that. The title track, the title of the album, Living in the Material World, I think is a really fun little song. It gives off a lot of kind of Beatles vibes in that one. And on the Spotify version that I have, there's some bonus tracks on there. And I think Deep Blue is a really strong track on there. I think that's definitely another quite underrated song. And overall, I just think Living in the Material World is a really, really strong album. I'll show you Cloud Nine. At number 2, we have Cloud 9 from 1987, and George actually took a bit of a break between Gone Troppo and this album. I think it was about 5 years, and this is a really fantastic album. I mean, so many great tracks. Cloud 9, the song, obviously the title of the album, that's a really good song. Fish on the Sand is really good. This Is Love as well. When We Was Fab, again, another really great song. And obviously, you've got other songs on here as well. Devil's Radio, and obviously the most famous track on here, Got My Mind Set on You, and that's probably my favourite on the album. But overall, this album, what I like about it also, not just the songs, but the overall just sort of quality of the songs in terms of how it sounds, you can tell is a lot better than his previous albums. And not to say that they were bad, but it's just I think obviously Jeff Lynne from the Electric Light Orchestra. It's a bit of a mouthful, but he kind of helped produce on this, and I think it definitely is for the better. I think, as I said, the albums that George had done before this weren't poorly produced at all, but I think Jeff Lynne just made them a lot better. And this is just a really fantastic album filled with some great songs. And yeah, there's not much to say really. Just a fantastic album, and easily not just one of George's best, but one of the best albums of all time, in my opinion. It's not really much of a surprise what number one is. I think kind of a lot of people would guess this going into the video if you know your George Harrison albums. But honestly, there's a reason why so many people say that this is his best album. You've got to agree, it's jam-packed with so many great songs. I mean, I could list all these songs and say that they're all amazing. Even the sort of Apple Jam instrumentals, I mean, they're not terrible. They're like they're musically they're very good. I just think the only real problem is just they're a bit long. But there's one that's like 11 minutes. But yeah, this is just a fantastic album overall. You've got I'd say the standout tracks here. I mean, it's hard to kind of narrow them down, but I'd probably say My Sweet Lord, Isn't It a Pity, What Is Life, Let It Down. I'd probably say Beware of Darkness, Ballad of Sir Frankie Crisp, Awaiting on You All Things Must Pass. This is just jam-packed with so many great songs, because obviously, back in the Beatles kind of era, George Harrison only really got like 1 or 2 songs, 3 if he was lucky, per album. So he'd obviously had, loads of songs, kind of stored up, and this is him just kind of showing what he was capable of. And I think it proved to a lot of people that he was, just as good as John and Paul. And it really shows, because the song quality on here is fantastic. I would say this is easily a contender for my favourite album of all time. I'd have to really think about it, but it's definitely up there. It's just a fantastic album. And I would honestly recommend that if you haven't listened to this album, give it a listen, because there's some really, really fantastic songs on here. So thank you guys for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed. Let me know your opinions. Do you agree, disagree? Do you think I overrated an album, underrated an album? I'd really like to get your thoughts. So if you could give this video a like, comment below, subscribe to my main channel, follow me on Twitter and Ask.fm. And once again, thanks for watching, guys.